I gave a talk on the history of vaccines. I emphasized the importance of mutations, what we call variants, as did Dr. Fauci and the CDC. Not too long after that talk, our country was hit with the Delta variant, causing a lot of illness and a lot of death. Now we have the Omicron and a whole bunch of different mutations. But tonight, I'm going to tell you that in fact, viruses and bacteria are absolutely necessary for the existence of humans and animals and plants. The microbiome. Microbiome, I'll describe it this way. Take a look at the person next to you for a moment. What you see is what I call the host. But, in fact, there is another you. And that's represented in this picture. There is a you that is viruses and bacteria and fungi. And it covers your whole body, and I'll illustrate that. You all probably are familiar with the fact that you can do an analysis of your DNA. Turns out that you can actually do an analysis of your microbiome. That's very new. In fact, the theory, the Hologenome theory, is very new. I'll talk a little bit about the company that's doing that. The people that are basically developed that company were from Los Alamos National Laboratory. So, this is a fairly complex talk. And now I can't move my...
The arrow.
I know, but it's not doing anything.
It's a space bar.
Space bar.
So what did you do?
I'll tell you later.
Okay, will it work now?
What I did was I hit the arrow right there.
Okay.
Now you just use these, okay?
Okay. Thank you, Nels. So the first thing I'm going to do is go over some definitions. And there is a sheet on your table that has a list of these different terms. A lot of them you may not be familiar with, so I thought it was important that I actually go over these with you. The microbiome, microbiota, I'll be using either word, refers to all the microbes associated with an animal or plant. The holobiome refers to an animal or plant host, remember what you see, together with all associated microorganisms living on or in it. That is exosymbiont and endosymbiont, respectively. Symbiont, an organism living in symbiosis with another. Endosymbiont is any organism that lives within the body or cells of another organism, most often, though not always, in a mutual relationship. Endosymbiont, a symbiont that lives on the exterior of the body of the host, for example, on your arms. Speciation, the formation of new and distinct species in the course of evolution. Homeostasis, a tendency toward a relatively stable equilibrium between interdependent elements especially as maintained by physiological processes. Eukaryote cells, any cell or organism that possesses a clearly defined nucleus. Organelles serve specific functions to keep the cell alive. Now, this is the actual theory itself. So before I actually go over this, probably most of you are familiar with the Darwin theory of evolution. Nels Hoffman and I have talked about some possible things you might want to add to that theory. But this is actually even different than that, because Darwin talked about the host. He didn't talk about the microbiome. So the question is, when you're actually studying evolution, what does the microbiome do? How does it evolve? So the hologenome concept of evolution is based on accumulated findings from which 4 basic principles have been extracted. All animals and plants harbor abundant and diverse microbiota and are thus considered holobionts, host with an endocellular and extracellular microbiome. The host, with its microbiome, the holobionts, functions generally as a distinct biological entity, anatomically, metabolically, immunologically, during development and evolution. A significant fraction of the microbiome genome, together with the host genome, is transmitted from one generation to the next, and thus can propagate unique properties of the holobiome. Genetic variation of the hologenome can be brought about by changes in the host genome, as well as by changes in the microbiome genome. Since the microbiome genome can adjust to environmental dynamics, and I'll talk about that a bit, more rapidly and by more processes than the host genome, it can play a fundamental role in the adaptation evolution of the holobiome. I don't expect you to read. This is a picture of you. And these are all different kinds of bacteria associated with you. Your nose, your mouth, your eyes, your ear, your stomach, your intestines, your genitalia, all over your body, both inside and outside. The human gut contains approximately 4 times 10 to the 13th bacteria, similar to the total number of human cells in the body. Because of the large diversity of bacterial species, the gut microbiome contains 9 million unique protein coding genes, or 400 times more bacterial genes than human genes. Viruses. Viruses usually are tiny biological particles made up of strands of RNA or DNA inside a protein coat. They can only replicate with the help of the host cell that they infect. And this is just an example. You have the protein coat, you have the genome, you have enzymes. That's basic anatomy. Some have an envelope, a lipid envelope, and an envelope of proteins. This is just an example of kind of the characteristics of viruses. They come in different shapes, and they are attached to different host cells, and they have different genetic code. And you have RNA viruses and DNA viruses, and you probably recognize the sphere. Okay, that's the coronavirus, like the coronavirus. Holobionts. All animals and plants are holobionts. On the next slide is a list of a few animals giving the number of bacteria species they have been found to contain. And by the way, this is a new area. They are studying all kinds of animals to find out how much bacteria they actually have. And this is just a small list. And I don't have a list of the plants, but they're doing the same thing for plants. As an example, the human gut contains about 5,700 species, and the skin about 1,000 species. I don't know if you can see that or not, but the honeybee has like 386 different species of bacteria. And the great ape has 8,914. This is a couple of examples. And again, this is a brand new area of study. I'm not going to talk about the things to the left, but I'm going to give you an example of how important bacteria are. For the nose, it's involved in mucus production and antimicrobial chemicals that assist. For the mouth, it assists digestion and to ward off pathogens. In the lungs, it lubricates pulmonary tissues. In the stomach, it prevents gastric complications. For the colon, it helps in digestion of complex carbohydrates. The sexual organs, it maintains pH and H2O2 production to kill microbes. Skin, fortify the immune system, and helps in scent production. A lot of different things that bacteria is doing for you. In humans, gut bacteria have been shown to perform several beneficial biochemical reactions that cannot be carried out by the host. In humans, the gut microbiome promotes the development of the immune system and body organs. Microbiomes produce heat, believe it or not. So in rest, they're actually producing heat in your body. This is a byproduct, the enzymatic catabolism of substance and synthesis of cell material. So, do you have the same microbiome as him? No, you don't. Everyone on the table there has a different microbiome. That's true over here, over here, over there, over there. You all have a different microbiome. What's really interesting is that if you're healthy, even though you have a different microbiome, it does for you what it should do. Isn't that, I find that incredible. I don't think they really understand that. So what influences it? Well, you've eaten pizza tonight, that influences your microbiome. If you drink coffee, that influences it. You drink wine, that influences your microbiome. So all kinds of foods, if you're vegetarian, like this picture, that's going to influence you. If you're meat, that will influence. If you get sick, that will affect your microbiome. So all of those things are involved in the microbiome. This I thought was really interesting. It turns out that in the woman, the fetus is protected from the mother. The placenta allows that to happen. If the placenta was removed, the mother would kill the child. I don't know how many of you knew that. I didn't really realize that. And that child is protected from viruses and bacteria. So how do they get the bacteria? Well, it's really interesting because what happens is that when the child exits the maternal vaginal fecal microbes that the body transmits, the birth channel, that's where it's getting its bacteria and viruses. In addition to that, most of you are probably aware of the fact that you get bacteria from your mother's milk. And this turns out to be unique. I studied this in detail. Your mother's milk really gives the child unique bacteria associated with that mother. Now, I have an interesting story related to that. It turns out that when I was born, my mother got very sick and she could not feed me. And so she had a friend that provided human milk for me. So I was getting the bacteria from her friend, in addition to the bacteria when I exited the birth channel. Now that was really fascinating. I have no idea what that did to me. Mitochondria. The next two examples are ways in which bacteria and viruses may have played a fundamental role in the evolution of humans. Mitochondria are membrane-bound cell organelles that generate most of the chemical energy needed to power the cell's biochemical reactions. So they're really important. Chemical energy produced by the mitochondria is stored in a small molecule called endocyne triphosphate. Mitochondria contain their own small chromosomes. Generally, mitochondria and therefore mitochondria DNA are inherited only by the mother. And this is an example of it's a theory of how the mitochondria may have evolved. And this is a situation where bacteria developed a symbiotic relationship with each other. So in the picture that you're looking at, one bacteria contains another. And eventually, those bacteria are able to help each other. They work together. And this situation is propagated through a long period of time. I think this is how the mitochondria actually developed. That's one of the reasons for that is there's similarities between mitochondria and bacteria, for example. Talked a little bit about the placenta. Once a viral protein, the virus essentially morphed. This is a virus now, or evolved into what we now know as synestin. This protein gives baby the ability to fuse cells into a wall, the placenta. That connects mom and baby, but also keeps them separate. It is believed that with time, this is how humans develop the ability to have babies, using the placenta without an egg. This isn't my quote, but I thought it was appropriate. It just seems like, in a way, we're part virus. Otherwise, we'd be laying eggs. Genetic variation, evolution of hologens. In addition to the well-recognized modes of genetic variation in all organisms, mutations, sexual recombination, chromosome rearrangement, and epigenetic changes, three underappreciated modes of genetic variation that are characteristic of microbiomes in the Hologenome are amplification or reduction of the number of specific microbial groups acquisition of novel microbes, and horizontal gene transfer. I'll talk a little bit about horizontal genes transfer. Newly acquired DNA is incorporated into the genome of the recipient through either recombination or insertion. Recombination essentially is a regrouping of genes such that native and foreign DNA segments that are homologous are edited and combined. Now, Nels and I ran into this particular subject on our talk on evolution. Turns out that if you have two bacteria that come close to each other, they can exchange DNA. Not only that, a bacteria can change DNA with a dead bacteria. And a virus can help the process. Now, one of the things that they found is that this particular process, horizontal gene transfer, actually was involved in the Japanese in their ability to break down agar. Turns out that people in our country cannot do that because we don't have the bacteria in our systems that allows us to do that. This is just a simple illustration of what happens. The bacteria can actually insert itself into the human body and give its DNA. One of the first indications of human microbes can be transmitted for many generations came from a detailed analysis of the sequence diversity of DNA isolated from Helicobacter pylori, present in different geographic human populations. The fact that the distinct sequence remains for centuries in offspring of an individual that has migrated to a different geological location argues for accurate vertical transmission, that is, long-lasting transmission, and has led to the use of pylori in resolving details of human migration. It is believed that humans have about 140 genes due to horizontal gene transfer. I mentioned that there's a company that will actually do your microbiome. This is the name of that company. It's Viome. One can have your microbiome analyzed by Viome company. They analyze the RNA populations of the gut bacteria to determine which genes are being expressed and which ones are not. This is more useful information than just the DNA sequence of the bacteria, since it tells you what the bacteria is doing. I actually know a person that had this done, and I was astonished. She got 14 pages of information about her microbiome, making a lot of suggestions in terms of how she could improve certain parts of her microbiome. And so this is new, interesting area. Religion and faith. From Genesis, God created man in the image of himself. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created him. My image of God and man has changed. It's much more complex than I imagined. The microbiome added to the host image creates a very different picture. And I've kind of illustrated that by the figures there. Some of the results of this study enabled me to have a much broader picture of creation. It's helped me appreciate how important all aspects of creation, that is, bacteria, viruses, fungi, need to be included. Like a lot of aspects of creation, there is a paradox. As we are all well aware, viruses can cause much death and put the world on its heels. Bacteria can do the same thing. Yet both are an important part of creation and needed for our very existence. How the microbiome is created and maintained is also fascinating for me. It relates directly to the host. Vertical transmission to the microbiome kind of reminds me of a relationship with God, steady. Horizontal transmission is like our relationships with others, changing, a lot of variety, important to our well-being, impacting our direction. God's work in putting together such a diverse mixture of his creatures for the creation of the human astounds me. How he intertwined elements like bacteria and viruses in such a way that humans can exist is amazing. It makes me wonder just how important all the little creatures are to the existence of the earth. I'm going to finish by reading from the New Testament. And those of you that heard Patrick's talk, you know, he emphasized the importance of logic. And I agree, logic is important. But what I'm going to read to you, for me, illustrates another aspect of creation. This is from Matthew chapter 6, beginning with verse 26. And I've got to take my glasses off. Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And which of you, by being anxious, can add 1 cubit to his span of life? And why are you so anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet, I tell you, even Solomon, in all his glory, was not arrayed like one of these. Why did I pick that? As a scientist, I'm a person who takes things apart, tries to understand them by putting them into different components, you know, trying to understand one component after the other. You know, that's how you learned how to fly. You know, you have a lot of information about birds, you know, their weight and their wings and things like that. It's all mechanical, okay? But if for a bird, you also have the colors, and you ask yourself, how important are the colors? Well, sometimes they're very important. Do we really understand all of that? Probably not. Then you have the songs, you know, and the question is, do we really understand how the birds are talking to each other or what they're saying? So, when I look at all that, I ask myself, even that's not enough, but there's still a mystery associated with a bird. In some ways, a mystery associated with a human. And so that's where I'm going to end.
Very, very interesting. Thank you, Glenn. That was very, very interesting. Okay, we take some questions from the audience. You'll have to come up and use the microphone.
Yeah, so
and
I
this
can.
microphone so people on Zoom can hear you. Dan, did you have a question?
talk into this and into this, and I talk to you too, or what?
All three.
Can't look like people one time. Glenn, it was a very interesting talk. One of the things I'm wondering about are these guys, nowadays, people can do very, detailed experiments inside a cell. Like it seems hard to believe, but you can go into a cell and manipulate the genes or the parts of the DNA and so on and so on. Are people doing experiments like that for this kind of thing? Are these guys, or, you didn't mention any experiments.
Yeah. Actually, one of the questions that you have is related to that. One of the obvious things is, what are all the different reasons for studying the microbiome? Well, one of the reasons is to study disease. And the question is, how far along are we? Well, there's a paper about that that a friend of mine gave me recently. And they were looking at pancreatic cancer and what other form of cancer that could be associated with some of the bacteria in the microbiome. Okay, I didn't want to talk about that, didn't want to scare you. But certainly that is one of the reasons why they're very interested in this. The other thing I didn't mention is that it's really new. There's a lot of bacteria that they have not been able to analyze because they don't have the ability to do that yet. Okay? Gary, come on up. And also talk to them.
Found an interesting talk, Glenn. The scriptures tell us a lot, and science and the scriptures are really interesting when you put them together. So one of the profound experiences in the Bible was when Jesus exited the tomb and meets the disciples on the shore of the lake, as the disciples are sort of lost. They don't know what to do at this point because Jesus is gone. But there he is, he's on the shore of the lake, and they're fishing, and he calls them on the shore. He has cooked some fish, and he has some honeycomb, and they sit down and they eat together. The implications of Jesus being resurrected as an immortal, physical individual who eats is really interesting because of what we know about what goes on in the body with regard to the consumption of food. I think that there have been speculation among philosophers that God is intrinsically separated far from this world, but that, I think, gives us cause to think maybe he's not. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, actually, I can. Actually, there was a comment that I didn't include in my religious and science thought, and it's partly related to what you're talking about, but it's before the resurrection. I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the fact that Christ was aware of what the Pharisees were thinking over and over again, right? How is that possible? That's the first thing. The second thing that I wondered about is whether or not Christ had knowledge of the microbiome. Certainly, there's no way that he would talk about that, but in his healing processes, I wondered if in fact his knowledge actually was related to that, really far out, but it makes me wonder, partly because of the fact that he seems to know what people are thinking, and other things that are pretty clear in the New Testament. So, yeah, it's interesting. So that's the way I'd respond to what you said.
Any questions from Zoom, so we can go ahead and take discussions.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's thank Glenn one more time. Please review the questions at your tables, and Glenn will wander around and chat with as many of you.
How are we doing tonight? Any comments? The questions they have out on the table are, have you had any experience where you became aware of your microbiome? Does it bother you that viruses and bacteria can cause illness, yet are absolutely necessary for life? You can have your microbiome analyzed. Would you have it done? Why or why not? Does the hologenome theory of evolution suggest that Darwin's theory is lacking? How does your understanding of the role of bacteria and viruses on life affect your understanding of how God created life and how it might fit into a slow process? There's been a lot of discussion about keeping everything free of viruses and bacteria. Could this cause a problem? Do you think that the microbiome might be used to study disease? Some people have said the gut with its microbiome is the human's second brain. What do you think of that statement? And the last question they have is, what do you think God's purpose was in making us dependent upon viruses and bacteria? How are you doing, Steve? Long time no see.
Yeah, hi, Eric. I've been meaning to send you a note. I enjoyed your talk, and I especially like the fact that you have followed Teilhard de Chardin.
Yeah, he's a fun
And
character.
back in the 60s, he was finally being accepted by the church, and especially those of us in science tended to hook up with his thinking.
Yeah. It's pretty interesting, actually, his approach to it all, I think.
Yeah, I haven't gone back really and looked at it critically now. And at the time, being fairly naive in science, I probably accepted pretty much of what he had to say
Yeah.
without thinking too
It's
much of
hard
it.
reading, you know.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if it's because they're all his notes and they were never edited into a book. You know, I mean, those were all published posthumously. And,
Right.
You know, nobody, you know, I suspect the person he left them with didn't really feel like they should edit him. And plus they were translated out of French. So
Right.
I don't know if it's just the awkwardness of the translation or